every single micrometre of this root is a site for relationship. And if mycorrhizal fungi colonise those roots, those relationships will be multiplied perhaps 10 times. So it's mind-boggling the amount of relationships that are possible in soil. But nearly all of it could diminish if the land is ploughed and planted with the monoculture annual crop. And this is one of the great tragedies of the loss of many really bioproductive grassland areas across the world. So I'm very interested in the ethical status of soil ecosystems amid production agriculture in contemporary southeastern Australia, using the case study of pasture cropping. So I look at the ways in which damage to soil has been normalised, and also how this normalisation is being called into question, particularly by farmers who are becoming more sensitive to the impacts of their tools upon soil ecosystems. So this has rendered the situation of soil ecosystems acknowledgeable. And I'm really interested in the question of what makes soil distress acknowledgeable. So soil integrity is, I see it as the capacity of a soil ecosystem to hold together and to maintain distinct structures so that it can perform functions that enable its flourishing, including supporting many forms of life. And this is a picture that's now been circulated quite widely, including on Facebook, you might be familiar with, and that's from 2008 National Geographic. But it's contrasting on the left-hand side a grassland with really deep root systems, and on the right-hand side a annual crop, grain. So when soils lose integrity and degrade, the particles become less connected to others. The texture shifts from spongy with abundant pore spaces to compacted, hard, rock-like. As soil declines in its ability to support biodiversity, fungi, invertebrates, microorganisms, but also plants, a vicious cycle can set in as biological relationships themselves help to constitute soil's functionality. So a major issue for land ethics is that dominant understandings of what soil is and should be have rendered the distress of soil ecosystems unacknowledgeable. For centuries, if not since the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, extreme levels of soil disturbance have been normalised and even idealised. Cultural tropes in the West celebrate the plough as an enabler for civilization. Others aestheticize ploughed landscapes through pastoral imagery of bare fields. And this one is Vincent van Gogh. Ploughing even has become a shorthand for agriculture itself. The sentence, "he exchanged a plough for a pen," illustrates this metonymic relation. But the main problem isn't disturbance per se. Appropriate scales and intervals of disturbance can enhance processes of renewal in soil, as in the case in other ecosystems. Disturbance can be a good thing if it doesn't disrupt the conditions of possibility for continued free association and diversification of the bulk of life in the soil. But excessive disturbance disrupts the pore spaces in soil. And so there's no longer oxygen, so it means that aerobic organisms can't survive, although anaerobic organisms may still be able to survive. As well as starving soil ecosystems of their food supply, which is the sugars that exude from plant roots. So for practitioners, for farmers, if they want to preserve the complexity of soil, then judging the right intensity and frequency of disturbance requires skill, care, and attunement to local conditions. we can see here soil that it's in California. I saw this on Facebook yesterday, that this is actually soil that is for organic agriculture. That you can't even discern any variation in the texture there. That it looks like sand, and it looks lifeless. So there's someone on Facebook who's saying, organic California, you are kidding yourself. And there's people who are there's sad faces and shocked faces, yeah, which indicate a certain level of sensitization to the condition of soils that's growing. In organic methods, ploughing, unfortunately, is sometimes viewed as difficult to avoid because it reduces weeds without spraying them, whereas there are other methods where weeds are removed by spraying. So we need to appreciate the aesthetics of soil differently in order to care for it adequately. As we know from phenomenology, seeing is complex and socially mediated. We can only abstract some things from their backgrounds because of pre-existing meanings, gestalt pictures, and so on. When it comes to soil, the overwhelming popular understanding of soil is atomistic. Soil is still seen as synonymous with dirt. It's seen as a bulk good that is fungible and endowed with little developmental capability. What is often not appreciated is soil's interconnectedness. As I mentioned, as I might have mentioned before, it's a bit like the difference between flour and cake. Whereas flour is composed of discrete particles of a raw substance, cake is a textured, spongy entity that is connected laterally, that tastes fundamentally different to flour, and it's structured as an interconnected matrix of air bubbles as well as fluffy matter. Tim Ingold's concept of a meshwork is useful to describe the distributed quality of soil's coherence, representing the diverse relations that constitute it as intersecting paths of movement and interaction by diverse organisms. Here he explores the idea as it applies to the ground. An analogy might be drawn with a textile whose surface is not the same as those of all the strands of which it is woven, but it is nevertheless constituted by them. It is a mesh or a matrix of lines. In places, the ground might be more granular than textural, heaped up rather than knotted, as with sand dunes or a stone shingle. But as we have repeatedly observed, a ground that was purely granular, all blobs and no lines, could harbour or nourish no life. In recent years, injuries to soil have become much more acknowledgeable by farmers. The dominant view previously was that soil was simply a medium for growth, rather than also growing and itself being worthy of attention and care. So no-till, and particularly what I call beyond no-till methods, represent a shift in thinking regarding the soil, where farmers work together with life rather than attempt to harness it, reworking productionist cultures from within, in the words of Maria Puig de la Bellacasa. So no-till and low-till techniques have become widely adopted in recent decades across 110 million hectares of farmland worldwide. In contrast to conventional ploughs, machines for no-till farming minimally slice through the soil, just separating it enough to enable the planting of seeds. This gently impacts soil structure, leaving the profile intact. Conventional ploughing, by contrast, inverts and churns the soil, and it breaks up the structures and exposes the subsoil to sunlight, which can kill delicate fungi and dry out the structures there, as well as oxidising the carbon there that holds together and creates the sponginess in the soil. So compared with tillage systems, no-till systems reduce erosion, improve water flow and water retention. They also are biologically richer. They have significantly higher earthworm populations and tend to be much richer in fungi. However, the most common methods of no-till tend to rely on herbicides such as glyphosate to get rid of the weeds. This can have detrimental impacts on soil biology, particularly mycorrhizal fungi. So, building on low-till methods, some farmers have modified these practices, finding ways to reduce their chemical usage. And one of the examples of a beyond low-till method in Australia is pasture cropping. So pasture cropping is similar to no-till, but it doesn't utilise herbicide, and it involves planting crops within perennial grassland. And so there's a ground cover that is year-long, that's like a living mulch. And so you have oats, which are annual plants, being planted into a grassland. So neighbours Colin Sayce and Darryl Clough developed this method at a time when financial problems made their usual purchases of fertiliser and herbicide untenable. Rather than spraying glyphosate before planting their crops, they left the grasses alone and planted seeds such as barley, oats, rye and canola directly into the grassy field. This has a slightly lower productivity than some forms of farming, but because of the vastly reduced inputs, it actually is economically much better, much more viable than conventional farming for them. So I visited Winona, which is Colin Sayce's farm, at one of the field days where they invited farmers to come along and have a look at what they were doing. And we were shown several fields with recently planted seedlings emerging from them. So at the time when they planted these oats, the grass was going dormant, and so it didn't compete with the crop. And it was also lightly grazed prior to planting, which gave a very moderate level of disturbance to the land. And it also provided a little bit of fertilisation. But after 18 years of doing this, Colin has achieved some quite remarkable results. And that's the machinery of planting. He's got some compost tea that he also squirts in with every seed, which also helps to boost it, inoculates it. It helps to boost the microbiology there, and these very minimally impact the soil, and the seeds are up there. Yeah, so after 18 years, the number of native grassland species have increased from 9 to 60, and fungal biomass has increased over 862%. Bacteria increased 350%. Insect biodiversity increased to 125%. Insect biomass increased 600%. And over 10 years, he measured a 203% increase in soil carbon. So all these things are quite dramatic improvements in the ecological value of the land. And it also means that birds have a lot to eat because the insect biomass has so vastly increased, which is hopeful at a time when we're seeing plummeting insect numbers. I'll just stay at that for a second. So, beyond no-till practices such as pasture cropping, help to disclose soil integrity as not only a physical property that requires careful movement of machinery, but also as a property of interspecies relationship. So soil ecosystems are fed by plant roots carrying energy from photosynthesis, and when they lose that connection to plants, they suffer. As Kristen Olsen explains, when the ground is bare, that partnership between soil microbes and plants is broken and the soil ecosystem experiences famine. This is why Colin Sayce and Darryl Clough, their mentor Christine Jones, argues for year-long green farming so that the soil ecosystem is continually fed. Adopting techniques such as this and witnessing their results in improving ecological relations, farmers are now becoming more sensitised to the impact of practices that they didn't think twice about before, like ploughing. So, and now I have another example from Facebook. It has to be useful for something. So there's this. This is meant to be an inspirational meme. So it says, what you see depends on how you view the world. To most people, this is just dirt, but to a farmer, it's potential. And I just thought it was really funny to see all these people get morally outraged about the picture, and someone says at the start, how would you like it if somebody ripped your skin off? Go no-till with cover crops. Even better, put in pasture and mob graze it. Yeah, anyway, so there are people who are now outraged at seeing a ploughed field, whereas it sort of, so it didn't reach its intended audience, perhaps. Yeah, so the comment that likens ploughing of the soil to ripping off human skin personifies and sympathetically identifies with the soil, positioning it as part of a sensitive, integrated, vulnerable system that ought not to be disturbed. And this shows the emergence of an ethical sensibility regarding soil integrity among some farmers. So one of the issues at stake here is ethical acknowledgement. So can we recognise soil distress and respond to it adequately? Stanley Cavell has written about acknowledgement as involving a certain kind of responsiveness, whereby your suffering makes a claim on me. It's not enough that I know or am certain that you suffer. I must do something or reveal something. In a word, I must acknowledge it. Otherwise, I do not know what your or his being in pain means. The concept of acknowledgement is evidenced equally by its failure as by its success. So, acknowledgement involves a moment of taking responsibility for a situation of distress, and that makes possible an ethical response. As Michael Uhl writes, acknowledgement is the affect that makes possible further affective and embodied responses. We might then modify our action to take into account the situation of the other, when we might otherwise have been tempted to neglect this duty. The situation calling for acknowledgement interrupts habitual everyday practice, and we cannot proceed as before. In my view, acknowledgement doesn't require mutual embodiment. So I think it can involve human-soil relations. But one thing it does require is that an object of concern can be perceived as coherent enough that we can see that it's either broken or in distress. And this has been the major problem for soil. So many indicators of integrity in soil have long been imperceptible, insignificant, and overlooked by land-based practitioners and lay people alike. This has meant that it has been very difficult to even acknowledge a situation of excessive soil disturbance or degradation. Thus, very few people have taken ethical responsibility for soil. It's often only in hindsight, after witnessing abundant soil ecosystems demonstrating their diverse capabilities, as we can see in the example of pasture cropping, that we even realise that there has been a huge loss. Encouraging the recognition of soil flourishing can involve developing empirically adequate but also aesthetically rich descriptions that make soil integrity more perceivable. Scientist Christine Jones describes healthy soil as fragrant and with an appearance like chocolate cake. Similarly, David Montgomery writes, fertile soil crumbles and slides right off a shovel. Look closely and you'll see a whole world of life feeding life, a biological orgy, recycling the dead back into life. Healthy soil has an enticing and wholesome aroma, the smell of life itself. So describing soil in these sorts of ways, these people encourage us to encounter the diversity, vitality and integrity of soil ecosystems in an embodied way. As Maria Puig de la Bella Casa writes when documenting numerous examples of enlivened engagement with soil, she says, through the senses we are invited to claim commonness and connection to the materiality we share with soil and other forms of elemental matter. Such close attention to soil helps to build respect for soil as an end in itself, in addition to being valued as a means. Accounts of soil such as these and practices such as pasture cropping help soil to become acknowledgeable as an ethical entity. They also help to build understandings that there is more to soil than its use. And that above all, that the use of soil itself can build ecological integrity at a landscape scale through sensitive construction of interdependent multi-species livelihoods.